philosophy is very simple. When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, say something, do something, get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble.
He was always different than every member of Congress. Everybody knew what he had done. He was John Lewis.
We're marching today to dramatize to the world that hundreds and thousands of Negro citizens denied the right to vote.
Congressman Lewis gave us the blueprint to organize and to legislate.
The reason why he's effective as a leader is because he's lived it.
We made a decision to march in an orderly, peaceful, nonviolent fashion from Selma to Montgomery.
You are ordered to disperse. This march will not continue.
I was hit in the head. My knees went from under me. I thought I was going to down the bridge.
If John Lewis, as a 19, 20-year-old, wasn't doing what he did, I would not be here.
We will march with the spirit of love and with the spirit of dignity that we have shown here today.
The whole time he was in the movement, it was frightening, knowing the danger, knowing what could happen.
You cannot replace a John Lewis.
He's the most courageous person I ever met.
Too many people struggled and died to make it possible for every American to exercise their right to vote.
He challenges the conscience of the Congress.
Bring common sense gun control legislation to the House floor.
40 years later, John Lewis continues to inspire us.
Are you with me? Let me hear you. 3 civil rights workers that were murdered for trying to help people get registered to vote are looking down on us.
This is a time for action. That's what I learned from John Lewis.
There are forces in America today want to take us back, but we're not going back. We're going forward.
Hello, and a warm welcome to you all. My name is Andrea Mark, and I am the chairwoman of the Social Justice Committee of the Pasadena Jewish Temple and Center. Looks like we're having a little technical difficulty. There you go. The Pasadena Jewish Temple and Center is located in Pasadena, California. We hope you and your loved ones are all well and safe. In the winter of 2017, we formed the Social Justice Committee. Honoring Jewish values, we've been involved in a wide variety of community events, including immigration, police reform, healthcare, asylum issues, voting rights, and now this, a celebration of John Lewis's life and legacy. As we head to the November 2020 elections, we are reminded of the fragility of our democracy, the wrongs that have been committed, and the work that we need to do. I want to thank the members of the Social Justice Committee who helped to put this program together. And in particular, I'd like to thank Juliana Serrano of All Saints Church in Pasadena. Juliana has been providing us with much needed technical assistance, and in fact, she is here today. Let me remind you, please, to use the Q&A pod, the question and answer pod. You have that option either at the bottom of your screen or the top of your screen, depending on what device you're using. Use the Q&A pod to ask your questions. And I want to remind you as well that we are recording this webinar. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator, Peter Dreyer. Peter is a co-founder of the Social Justice Committee. He teaches political science at Occidental College and chairs the Urban and Environmental Policy Department. His most recent book is called The 100 Greatest Americans of the 20th Century, a Social Justice Hall of Fame. He regularly writes for the Los Angeles Times, the Huffington Post, The Nation, and American Prospect. You may have seen him interviewed on TV by Bill Moyers, Rachel Maddow, Tavis Smiley, and Bill O'Reilly. Oh yes, that Bill O'Reilly. Peter will be taking your questions via the Q&A pod, so don't forget to post your questions there. Peter?
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you all of you who are in the audience. We have hundreds of people participating in this webinar, and it's a wonderful occasion to celebrate John Lewis's life. Back in 2016, after the election, one of Donald Trump's aides mentioned that John Lewis had criticized him. And Trump probably had no idea who John Lewis was, or that he was one of the most admired figures in American history. But the next day, being Trump tweeted that Lewis was, quote, all talk, 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 no action, no results. Sad. Well, you can imagine Trump doing that. But it sparked a controversy. People all across the country demanded that Trump apologize across the political spectrum, too. Of course, he didn't apologize, but his Twitter tantrum did have a big impact. Soon after he wrote that tweet, Amazon reported that sales of John Lewis's autobiography, called Walking with the Wind, a memoir of the movement, had spiked dramatically, and it had gone from the 15,000th best-selling book in the country to number 2 in the country on the bestseller list. So thank you to Donald Trump. If you haven't read John Lewis's autobiography, even so, you've learned a lot if you've watched this amazing documentary called John Lewis, Good Trouble. And now we're going to turn to the panel to hear their thoughts on the film, followed by questions from the audience. I'm going to introduce all of them at the beginning, and then I'm going to call on them in order for them to offer their ideas about the film and its lessons for our work fighting for social justice, and then you'll have an opportunity to ask them questions. We're going to start with Dawn Porter, who is the film's director. She's a graduate of Swarthmore College and the Georgetown University Law School. In 2013, she directed her first documentary film called Gideon's Army, about 3 Black public defenders in the Deep South, which premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, was broadcast on HBO, was nominated for an Emmy, and won lots of other awards for Best Documentary. She also directed The Spies of Mississippi, a documentary for PBS about the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, which was created basically to preserve Jim Crow segregation in Mississippi during the 50s and 60s. She directed the Netflix series Bobby Kennedy for President 2 years ago. She made a film called Trapped, which looks at the devastating impact of anti-abortion laws in the South and focuses on the last remaining abortion clinic in Mississippi. The film was so controversial that when they screened it, they had to hire police to guard outside the screenings and to check weapons at the door. Our second speaker is going to be Heather Booth, who's been an organizer since the 60s in the civil rights and women's movements. As a student at the University of Chicago, she went to Mississippi in 1964 to participate in the Freedom Summer Voting Project. Heather was a founder of the Chicago Women's Liberation Union. She created Jane, an underground abortion service, which was started years before Roe versus Wade. She also organized the first citywide campaign for decent childcare. She was a founder of the Midwest Academy, an incredible training center for organizers. In 2000, she directed the NAACP's Voter Fund. In 2008, she was the director of the healthcare campaign for the AFL-CIO. In 2010, she was the founding director of Americans for Financial Reform, which led to Congress passing the Dodd-Frank Act, including Elizabeth Warren's idea for a consumer financial protection agency. She was the national coordinator for the coalition around marriage equality and the Supreme Court decision which legalized same-sex marriage. She was also the lead organizer of a national coalition for comprehensive immigration reform. And if you want to learn more about Heather, there's a documentary about her called Heather Booth, Changing the World, which I highly recommend. Our third speaker is Laura Michelson. She's the producer of this film. She's also one of the founders of Sundance Productions with Robert Redford. She serves as its president for many years, and she executive produced several Emmy Award-winning documentaries, including HBO's Momentum Generation and the incredible CNN series Death Row Stories. She was nominated for an Emmy for Outstanding Documentary for All the President's Men Revisited on the Discovery Channel. And she's been the executive producer of many incredible documentaries, including with Dawn, the Netflix series Bobby Kennedy for President about his 1968 campaign, and another great documentary called The March, a documentary about the 1963 March on Washington. And our final speaker is Jessica Pierce, who's a national civil rights activist and youth organizer. She was the student body president at University of California, Santa Cruz. She was the organizing director for the United States Student Association, which is the umbrella for all the student governments across the country. She was the national chair of the Black Youth Project of 100. She was the national training director for the NAACP, where she helped coordinate a voter education, registration, and turnout project that led to over 1 million Black voters coming to the polls. She worked with a group called Generation Vote to increase voter turnout among young people. And now she trains people to become effective activists and organizers. So what an incredible panel we have. We're all looking forward to hearing from them. And we're going to start with Dawn Porter, the film's director. So Dawn.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having us here. It is an honor and a pleasure to have this many people join us, and it speaks so much to what you have organized and what we're able to share. So I have very fond feelings for Pasadena. I was able to screen my film Trapped there, and hosted by an incredibly warm community. Gideon's Army played. So I love the Pasadena community. So, but I'm also just really, I want to thank the organizers on this panel because I really have a fondness, as you can imagine, for organizers. While we, make work, I really want to thank you for your work, which is very similar to the Congressman's work, and that it goes on for decades. And as you can see, organizers, don't quit, they just move on to the next issue. And I'm very grateful to you. There is an intersection of civil rights issues, issues that are experienced of discrimination that are common to African Americans and to people who follow Judaism. I grew up in New York City and was the beneficiary of a multicultural education that ended up with me having Jewish godparents, because I was born in the 60s, and my parents picked people who would love me. They weren't so worried about my religious education, they were worried about my spiritual education. And so I will tell you that I did not know that being Jewish was a minority until I was 14. And there was the miniseries on the Holocaust. And my mother will tell you the story about how I confronted her and asked her how she could not have told me about this. And so I have always viewed our struggles as symbiotic, and always appreciated. My great grandfather is a man named Ben Robeson, brother of Paul Robeson, the great activist. And our church was the AME church, where they had many multi-faith organizing strategies. So I say all that to say, particularly when I feel like there is a rise of anti-Semitism that is not surprising since we see a rise in discrimination and bigotry. But this conversation is extremely important. And I am just very, very grateful for the opportunity to be here. So thank you for that. I will just say, because we really want to get to your questions, I worked with Laura Michael Chizen, who's a fabulous producer on the Bobby Kennedy for President series. And during that series, we interviewed Congressman John Lewis. And he told a story about organizing Dr. King's rally in Indianapolis in 1968. And John Lewis was a very, very young man, and he organized that rally for African-American community, for the African community. It was also the night that Dr. King was murdered. And Bobby Kennedy's older advisors, his white advisors, said it was too dangerous for him to speak to that crowd. And a very young John Lewis said, "You must speak to this crowd," and he did. And it is widely known as the time that Bobby Kennedy referred in public for the first time to his brother's murder, his brother's assassination. It had sent him into a very deep depression, his brother's murder. He talked about the need for empathy and peace in the name of Dr. King. And Indianapolis was a city that did not burn that night. So we heard that story, when John Lewis told us that story, it was not one that I had ever heard before. And so we realized, of course, there are so many stories that have not been told about his life and his legacy. And that was part of the reason why I think CNN came to us and said, would you like to do this film? I think it's also because they'd had a lot of success with their RBG film, and they were looking for like another 80-year-old who was hot stuff. So, they're on the 80-year-old kick. And since like RBG is, my super heroine, I am a lawyer by training. And so I very much admire her, revere her. I once met her in person, and it was like I was meeting, Madonna or Beyonce or something. So we, asked the congressman if he would do this film, and he did, and he gave us incredible access. And it was a joy. We followed him for about a year. We worked on the movie for 2 years. And he, I think he was really reflective and ready to tell his story. I'll close my remarks by saying that none of us could have imagined that this moment would be this moment, that we would be releasing this film in a time not only of a global health crisis, but also a renewed energy for a global reckoning on racism, anti-racism, and justice. And so I tend to be a very optimistic person, and I view this as an opportunity. And so while it is a very difficult situation, I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you. I think it's so great that we're all able to be here together. So I will just end with that.
Thank you, Dawn. Heather Booth.
If we organize, we can change the world, but only if we organize. That was the great lesson that I learned both from this movie and from working with the leadership of John Lewis when I was 17 and 18 years old in SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so I'm so incredibly grateful to be part of this panel today. These incredible filmmakers, Dawn and Laura, to provide this film at this moment of such both inspiration and peril. And it's so relevant because we have to do the organizing that helped to lead to that civil rights movement. We see the inspiration in the organizing today, and we see the peril all around us and how lives are threatened. So again, Dawn and Laura, we'll hear from you shortly. Thank you for creating this gift to the world, particularly now, and for John Lewis, whose leadership has been so extraordinary. We also hold him in our hearts while he's dealing with his own health issues. And important how he inspires all of us to carry on. I also was so glad to be on this panel. And Andrea, thank you for pulling this panel together with Juliana, but particularly to Peter Dreyer. We don't see each other much, but I read his writings. I'm inspired by them. I actually try to follow the kinds of insights he shares and feel just so aligned as we move forward to build a movement and to make this an ongoing movement and not just a moment. And then I'm also inspired also to be on this panel with Jessica Pierce, who you'll hear from later. We met when she was a student, and now she's one of my teachers. We're partners in a number of efforts, and she is a change maker of the present and of the future, and part of what gives me hope that we will see a better tomorrow, more just and democratic, because of the work of hers and other people that she's inspired. For my own background, Peter gave some of the history, so I'm not going to go through that, but just as a sort of a way into the movie, I was part of Freedom Summer in 1964 when John Lewis was the head of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And there are so many lessons out of that experience that are conveyed in this movie that are so important for us to learn for these times. The first I mentioned to me is, if you organize, you can change the world, but you need to organize. A second is to actually have love for people at the center of your heart. That love has to be what animates us, and hatred for injustice, both at the same time. And that it is the real people in the communities that make the change. And that is shown in the movie from great leaders like Ms. Hamer, Fannie Lou Hamer. Peter asked me to show this picture I have of her. Here I am at 18 years old, playing the guitar in front of Ms. Hamer here in Ruleville, Mississippi, with two of her friends. And it's wonderful that the movie recognizes her. And there's so many names who are not recognized by the general history. Many people think, oh, Dr. King, remarkable as he was, he knew that he wasn't the only one who made the civil rights movement. From Ella Baker, Julian Bond, a personal hero and deep friend, Bob Moses, and so many others. And it's so important to understand, to make change, the people most affected need to be the makers of their own history and can have support from allies and partners, and we can make that change together. But we need to hear the voices of those people who are most affected. And now with Black Lives Matter, those voices in the streets, as well as in the halls of Congress. And so I'm glad to be on this panel. I look forward to the conversation and the questions. And I turn it over to Laura now.
Thanks, Heather.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hello. Thank you for having me on this incredibly prestigious panel. I am Dawn's partner, producer, and I like to say good troublemaker. We've known each other, we're calculating, Dawn and I have known each other probably 8 or 9 years, but I did become such an admirer of Dawn's work when I saw a film she did called Gideon's Army. And it won all sorts of accolades and prizes at Sundance. And I was working with Bob Redford at Sundance Productions at the time. And I just remember thinking, this film is made by a director that I have a lot of admiration for. And one day I want to make some projects with her. And we did produce the Bobby Kennedy for President, which was an extraordinary opportunity. And I think as a producer and a media executive, which is what I do in my day job as well, I'm a creative officer for a production company. What is amazing when you get a chance to revisit the history, as we have just done in John Lewis, Good Trouble of this country, as well as, in Bobby Kennedy for President, you do realize that it is about organizing, mobilizing, and, as the congressman says, legislating. And I'm super honored to be on this panel because this is a group of people who do all of those things. Maybe we don't legislate, but we organize, we mobilize. And it's not lost on any of us that this summer, what, as Don said, during the global pandemic, during racial reckoning, the marching in the streets, that it is important to acknowledge that it's a young people who are going to make the change. And one thing we're really proud of about with John Lewis and the congressman's story is that it shines a light on a group of young people who frankly had everything to lose and chose to march and chose to protest and chose to fight for what was just and right. And this summer, as we're releasing this film, we're hoping that people all across this country recognize that it's going to be us, we the people, who are able to make change. It's a time, I was speaking with someone who's working on the Fair Fight, with the Fair Fight organization with Stacey Abrams, who's in our documentary. And they said, do you realize, Laura, that 4 million people who are turning 18 for the first time in the history of the states, this is the largest number of new voters coming into the system. And can we imagine that if we got all 4 million of those 18-year-olds to show up in November and cast a vote, how powerful that could be? So we're really hoping that this documentary, and thank you for watching it, those of you who have, and those who haven't, we look forward to having you watch it. But I think one of the real goals for this film is to inspire people that we all, every single one of us, have a vote and have a voice, and that it's really important not to feel disenfranchised or separated from that system, the important system of choosing who's leading us. I feel, frankly, that it's those who've come before us that have taught us the lessons, and it's now our mantle to carry. I'll tell you a very sweet story about the congressman. Dawn spent most of her time with him on the film. My job is the administration, so I get to be in the office working on the financing and the budgets and making sure everything is running smoothly. But what was so sweet, at one point, we got the congressman on a call, and he said to Dawn at one point, this was probably 6 months ago, as we're halfway through the project, and he said to Dawn, I'm putting your good name and my story in your hands. And Dawn said, yes, Congressman. And he said, and I have some funny stories to tell too. He said, I want to tell the funny stories. And we were very, very, very enthusiastic because, frankly, this is a politician, a civil rights activist, but also someone who everyone wants to spend time with. And in the film, you'll notice there are moments of humor and joy. He has a love of the arts. He collects visual art, paintings, sculpture, statues. He probably has one of the most significant collections of African-American and Black artists in the world that we know of. And he loves to talk about the fact that chickens are his favorite animal, and that he was inspired as a kid lecturing to the chickens that his family owned, and that taught him how to, as he said, get some attention, sometimes not. They wouldn't always pay attention. So we learned so much spending a year with the congressman. But I also want to say the other part of making a film like this is that these stories, not only should they be told and need to be told, but we're trying to craft them in a way that inspires a next generation, whether it's a next generation of documentary filmmakers, a next generation of young activists, a next generation of voters, a next generation of organizers, and a next generation of educators. That is really the goal. So I'm very honored to be here, and thank you all. And I have to do a shout out to Gail Gendler, who was one of my colleagues at Sundance Channel back 10 years ago. And she is the one who approached me and said, do you and Dawn, would you do this? And I was just like, of course we will, because it's such an honor to always have people who are engaged and interested in helping make a positive future happen. So thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Jess?
Right, I will be very quick here. Since I know that I'm sure folks have questions and would like to talk to everybody on the line. But first, thank you to Andrea, to Peter, to Heather. Oh my God, I mean, let's be honest, I've been fangirling for Heather literally since I was 18 years old. which is one of the reasons why I had to train with the Midwest Academy as soon as I got into political organizing. But thank you also to Dawn and to Laura, especially in this moment. I think I have a particular sweet spot in my training and my love of training around storytelling and the importance of storytelling. I really think that for people, all people, but especially for historically marginalized, oppressed people, our stories are oftentimes the one thing that can never be taken from us. And I really believe in the authenticity of telling real stories and the need to see that, and really just appreciated the different facets and pieces that were shared around his life, because so often the way that stories are told are never told correctly. And especially in this moment, I think about the fact that we have an election looming. I think about, COVID-19 and how, people are siloed right now. And so many of the people I work with are young people. These are high school students. These are college students, sometimes even younger. And, these are kids, even when we just look at the textbooks and the stories that are told in their textbooks, I'll be clear that, right, the vast majority of our textbooks in this country come from one state, the state of Texas. Which I love all you people from Texas, is nothing on you, but this is to say, this is a state, and a board that, was debating on whether or not to include Helen Keller and Hillary Clinton in textbooks. They were debating on whether or not they had to include President Barack Obama in textbooks, and it took people organizing, let's also be clear about the lineage of that story even, to organize to make sure that these people were even in textbooks, period. So much of what is getting to children right now, which is getting to young people right now, is filtered down, is not the truth, and it's definitely not telling stories that are powerful. And I think that that's really what this film does, is it gives us an opportunity to tell a real story of power building, and it's something that can hopefully inspire other people in this moment while people are looking for places of powerful work that's happening. And I think, the one thing I'll, just kind of end on here is, I've been keeping asked this question, today, because I've done work very much internally in, lobbying and being on Capitol Hill. But the vast majority of my work now works, mainly in movements and helping folks identify the work that they want to do. And so in this moment, folks have asked, how do we make this moment a movement? What does that look like? And, I oftentimes have like a canned ready response, and I've like really challenged myself to be like, okay, honestly, what does that really mean for me in this moment? And I think for a second, I had to take a step back and realize, this, framework of the civil rights era being something of the past is not something that is helpful for that period of time or for now. And I think the reality is, when we look back, it's less than 60 years ago when the first freedom rides happened. That John Lewis is the age of my friends' parents and people I work with in this work now. This is not a historical black and white, old, leave it in the textbook type of moment. The civil rights work is still now. So, I would say to people, what you see in your streets is definitely very much of the civil rights movement. And, I also see people saying, but what about protests, or what about the election, or what about traditional campaigns versus protest? And we actually, taking the blueprint from John Lewis, have to do it all. We do not necessarily we have not had the power. The power has been taken away from us. So how do we get the power back? It's by not making a choice about which tactic is better. It's not about, saying is protest violent or nonviolent, because the reality of the situation is, I believe that there is no way that we can say that people are being violent when the state and the systems that have guided their lives have been more violent and have never been held accountable. So if we want to hold the systems accountable first, then I'll open up a question about entertaining the individual violence that folks feel like they might be seeing, and I know that it is a spectrum, and I'm not saying that everybody has to find themselves onto every aspect of the spectrum, but, it is important that we understand that it's going to take us all doing the work to actually get to what we want to see.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Jess. So I have a question for the two filmmakers. What surprised you the most in making this film about what you didn't know or were surprised to learn about John Lewis and about his impact? Because we all know the story. We've heard his story about growing up and preaching to the chickens and becoming active in SNCC and being trained by the Reverend Jim Lawson, who lives here in Los Angeles and is still an activist. So we know that story. Then he got elected to the city council in Atlanta. Then he got elected to Congress, and he still gets arrested while being a member of Congress. So we know that story. What surprised you in spending so much time with him and his friends and family.
You know, yeah, sure. I think one of the things that I wanted to highlight was the strategy that John Lewis helped design and implement. And, you know, I'm interested when I hear, you know, Jessica and Heather speak about, I'm sure that they will appreciate and can elaborate on, people don't just show up to a march like that, to a movement like that. And, you know, one of the things that struck me was John Lewis and the other civil rights activists are often described for their bravery. We put their bodies center. We don't put the strategy, like what those students following on the groundwork laid by the adults of Nashville, but what those students then took to another level was a really political genius, right? They desegregated a southern town, the first town in America to become integrated, downtown Nashville, was at the hands of those student organizers. So I think centering his intelligence was, it's not that it surprised me, but it was surprising to me how little it is mentioned in our description of him. So that was one thing. So part of what I wanted to do with some of the footage that you see is back us up from those moments that we know about. Back us up from the time on the bridge. Back us up from before he went to help organize the Freedom Rides, or before he spoke at the March on Washington, or so many critical moments in his life. And I wanted to look a bit at the before. So, because I think that is what helps us understand today. It also helps us understand Mr. Lewis, because once you understand that, you know, he was a religion major, he studied philosophy, he studied under Jim Lawson. So once he decided that this was the animating principle of his life, he's not gonna change that. This is nonviolence, organizing, working for equality. That's who he is. And so people say, like, why did he do X, Y, and Z? It's like saying, why does somebody breathe? You know, he tells you why he did it. He hated segregation. He hated discrimination. It's really as simple as that. And he didn't go out seeking to be the leader. He was propelled forward because he was skilled. And I'd like to talk about his skill.
Great. Thank you, Dawn. Laura, do you want to add anything about what surprised you?
Yeah, sure. I think what else surprised me is I learned that Kennedy, who was president during the March on Washington, actually was trying to convince them to hold off. And this is an incredible part of history. He was actually encouraging SNCC and the leaders and the organizers to hold off. And it was only under pressure that they gave out the permits very, very last minute to allow them. I use that as an analogy for what's happening today, and just talked about what the marching in the streets. They didn't ask for permission. They forced that permission. And I think that is exactly, and it's true, 60 years is not that long, and it's not that long ago, and it should be much longer ago that those things were happening. But the marching that we're seeing in the street today for Black Lives Matter and for racial justice is exactly what has to be happening, because no one is going to grant these changes if we don't take to the streets. And I think, Heather, your work has inspired many, many of us. And I do feel like this moment we're in, in my mind, there is no coincidence that we're also coming to a huge election. And that should be my number one goal, is making change in November this year.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. So there's a couple questions here for Heather and Jess. So I'll ask Heather first and then Jess to answer this. So we've seen this huge uprising in the last couple months, triggered by the murder in Minneapolis, but really the product of pent-up anger and frustration for many years about racism in America. And so we have millions of people over the last month in the streets protesting. We see people talking about changing our criminal justice system. We see people, many white and black people together, and Latino and Asian people together in the streets. And the question that was posed by one of the people in the audience is, how do we sustain this? You can't protest in the streets forever. How do you keep this going, this movement going, so that it has longevity, it can be sustained, and it has real results in changing not only our attitudes, but changing public policy? So Heather, you want to start, and then Jess?
You know, in large part, it depends what we all do, what all those 200 and more people who are watching this now, what you do every day. In the 60s, there was sometimes we'd say, are you willing to die for freedom? And some people did die, and some people may die in this struggle. But I think the issue now is, will you also live for freedom and justice and democracy? And will you do the work that's needed every day, not romanticizing some past, not romanticizing the present, but saying, will you do the work every day? Will you make the phone calls? Will you do the texts? Will you write the letters? When we can we go door to door? Will you speak to people? Will you make the films? Will you talk about them? Will you go to the clubs that you're part of? Will you do the work every day when it's too boring, it's too hot, it's too cold, I'm too tired? Will you carry on this struggle? And the kind of commitment in our hearts that John Lewis had and that everyone on this panel has that leads us to do this work. So I think the main point is not to just leave it as that moment that Jessica talked about, but making it into this ongoing movement and organization. And then Laura mentioned, and so many things are needed. It's not just one thing. We need to be outside and in the streets. And it is part of what's so inspiring is those who've studied it say this may be the largest set of demonstrations in the history of the United States, certainly in the history of the last 50 or 60 years. And that more people are involved and more kinds of people and more young people coming to the front. So we need people on the outside in the streets. We need partnerships with those on the inside, like Congressman Lewis, and more on the inside who reflect that connection with those in the streets and with those who believe in this movement for change. We do need to make this into both the political agenda. It's 114 days we have until the election. What we do every day really matters. And then we have to keep on the organizing as the legislation goes on. So there's efforts from the outside, in the streets, onto the inside with the legislation, working hand in hand and not stopping and never stopping. There was a song in the civil rights movement that went, freedom is a constant struggle. It says, oh Lord, I've struggled so long, we must be free, we must be free. But it is a lifelong commitment, a lifelong struggle.
Thanks, Heather. And then we'll go to Jess.
Yep.
And then Dawn, you wanted to say something. So.
Yeah, so just on that, I mean, I completely agree with everything that Heather's just said. I also think that, you know, I have to do my due diligence to appropriate storytelling and also name that, you know, there's a lot that came into this moment. And you know, one part of it being the work of the Movement for Black Lives and the work of organizations that started 7 years ago, 8 years ago, that were all led by young Black folks, mostly Black, queer women leading these movements that have been investing in a lot of these cities where we saw the largest protests or the most consistent protests are also the places where you know, the organizations of the Movement for Black Lives have built the most power or have been running local campaigns or have been bailing people out of jails. And so definitely that's, I think, a part of it is one noting that, you know, this has been brooding and building and has been the work of strategy of a lot of different organizations and people. I think also the perfect chaos of this moment, right? You know, we're talking about people, you know, that were locked in their houses for months if they had a house, you know, and then adding on top of that an economic recession leading towards a depression, on top of the, you know, the country being the most polarized it has been in a very long time, and viscerally and vocally so. And I think, you know, kind of acknowledging all of those things allows us to kind of also see the blueprint of what we need to continue to do, right? We have to address the root cause issues of what's really going on. We can't just, you know, yes, it is about defunding the police, but let me be very clear in that statement on the flip side of that, because that is a reactive framing, that what we're actually talking about is people are crying out right now to be funding the critical services and the lives that have not actually been invested in. You know, a quote that folks have been saying right now from MLK, right, is that a riot is the language or the voice of the unheard, right? But there's a second part of that that is so critically important, which is, what is it that America has not heard? And what is it that America has not heard is, what are the needs of its people? And it has not prioritized that. And so that is the roadmap of what we have to prioritize and what we must do. And I think that, you know, what it is that what you all, or what each of us has to do, is look at what we've done over the past couple of months and say, how are we going to continue to do what we did over the past 30 days, over the past 60 days as a lifeline commitment? So if you donated to Black Lives Matter, I'm happy you did so, but do you know the 5 local organizations that are doing work around Black issues locally? Are you investing into those people? Are you investing into those leaders? Do you know the Black people in your community? Are you having conversations with your family? What is the way that you're showing up in your workplace, and making sure that how you're showing up as a workplace, as a person in every single space, is representative of what we're calling for in this moment? That's the question. I think you have to wake up every day and ask that question. And if you can wake up every day and ask that question and have an answer, no matter how big, how small, how giant the baby step seems to be, then I think that you're doing the work that is called right now.
Great, thank you. John, there was a question for you about being part of a team of women and the role that women are now playing in the film industry, and particularly in the documentary film world. Want to say something about that?
I do, and I also want to apologize to everyone. I do have to drop off early, but you're in very capable hands, because I could really hear you you all speak like forever. So working with Laura is very intentional and important to me. She is a person who has always championed women and has taught me so much about empowering women. We have a group of super women that we work with routinely. You know, I was a lawyer in my early career, and that's how I began. And at some point, I was working in networks. I was working at ABC, and then I was working at A&E Television, and I realized I was never going to get the promotion that I wanted. I was never going to do get the opportunity to be the storyteller. I was always going to be in a support role. And so I really just started to do it myself. I went on my vacations and my summers, and I went to conferences, and I figured out like financing and all the rest of it until I had a film. I did that for a year. And I just literally went to every documentary film festival and conference that I could figure out how to get myself to. And I think that there's, you know, a lesson in that, which is, if you wait for someone to give you permission, you may never get to do what you want. And so was it risky? Yes. And I'm lucky because I have a partner who was supportive of that effort. You know, we took a financial hit as a family, but I have 2 children, and I realized if I was going to do work, it had to be meaningful work. I didn't want to just get on the train in a nice suit and make the world safe for corporations. So that, you know, that was my motivation, that I wanted to be able to look at my children and be proud of what I was contributing to the world. So that is one thing. I do want to say something quickly about the music. Laura found this brilliant composer, Tamara Kali. She also scored the movie Mudbound by Dee Rees. Mm-hmm. And, you know, Laura just made this happen. And we didn't think we could afford her. We didn't think she would do it. She hadn't done a documentary before, and she said yes. So I asked her to write a modern spiritual, because one of the things I wanted to do is connect John Lewis's past to his present. And the land is so important to him. John Lewis knows where he comes from, and his people work so hard. They were sharecroppers. They worked so hard in order to be able to have that land. That is why he tells that story. There's a great oral tradition of repeating stories so that they are passed on, and he is part of that tradition. So Tamar Kali just spoke. Her music speaks to the archive that we gathered, but I think her score really elevates the film and really is its own character. It is a reminder. It is a soothing score, but there's an urgency to it. And the music was really, really important for us here. I am going to sign off unless there's any other really urgent question. I thank you all so much for having us. I leave you in Laura's capable hands. She knows everything I'm going to say. I'm so thrilled at seeing the organizers here. I am in awe of you and how you stay optimistic, and please keep doing your work, and please keep in touch with us and let us know how we can support. So, and I hear you about what work you need to do, whatever racial background you belong to. We all need to do this work, and not make assumptions about whether you're doing it or not.
Thank you, Dawn. What a joy to be with you.
Such a joy. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dawn.
Good night.
Thanks, Dawn.
So I have a question for actually all three panelists. One of my friends, Robin, asked a question about skill. Dawn, before she left, said she was surprised at the skill that John Lewis had as an organizer. And I know when I teach my organizing class, one of the first things I say, repeating what Heather often says, is being right isn't enough, being passionate isn't enough, being idealistic isn't enough. They're all good things, but there's a skill and a discipline to organizing. What was it about John Lewis's skill that made him so effective? Heather, do you want to start?
I think there are different levels to it. In part, I think that he is centered in a set of moral values that he knows where he's going. He knows who he comes from. He knows who he cares about. He knows who he's fighting with and for. Because in organizing, we often aren't sure about exactly what to do. And one of the things I think that often holds us back is our own insecurity. Sometimes people say, well, the greatest, did you have fear when you were an organizer? And they mean fear for your life. But I think there's another fear, and that's just the fear of, will I know what to do? Will I be good enough? Will I be smart enough? Will I know enough? And to overcome that, you need to be rooted in what you're fighting for and know why the fight is worth the effort. I think the second thing is he listened to people. He didn't promote himself as the great orator above everyone else. He was amongst the people. It's one of the things that SNCC did. And you sort of twice with your ears, once with your mouth. And he heard what people said and then could find ways to build up their own leadership and their own confidence. He also knew there had to be a relationship between movement and organization. And SNCC built organization on the ground of real people in the communities. And then I'd also say that part of a strategy is building power. And that you know that over time, it's not just a demonstration, as important as that is, but it's pushing to get a reaction. And when you get a reaction, you then consolidate it to add more people and more people to build your power. So I think that his brilliance as an organizer was rooted in his moral courage, his sense of knowing where he came from, where he was going, and who he was working with and for. And then in knowing that he had to create a plan of action to get a reaction and to build power and consolidate that in organization.
Good. Thank you. Jessica, you want to add to that?
I'm sure. I think just to add to that, I would probably say, I think that let's be clear, one big piece of it is, he had something at stake, and I think that when you have something at stake, you're willing to take a risk. And being willing to take a risk is really important. And I think it's one of the things that goes into skill is that skill is not, a certain educational degree or getting a certain certificate or going to enough trainings, right? Skill at some level is having an experience, continuing to apply that experience, and being open to continuing to try to learn new things, to build new things, to take those risks. And I think, even in thinking about recent interactions with him, I think that there are places where, John Lewis is willing to take a risk when others weren't, especially if we're talking about other legislators. And, or where he was willing to come out on an issue that people previously hadn't heard him come out, or hadn't heard him have a statement on, And I think that leadership, especially as we look at issues like immigration, LGBTQ issues, especially in this moment, looking back at how he did that, you can't take that importance out of it. And so I think even looking at the organizers right now who are willing to say, yes, we have to have reparations, and yes, we have to defund the police. That is a risk right now. But that risk has already actually created tangible victories. And so I think that is in addition to all of the ingredients, that Heather so tactfully put into the pot, I'd sprinkle that one on top.
Thank you. Laura, what impressed you with Congressman Lewis's skill?
I mean, he has not stopped. I think it's very easy to lose momentum and drive. And he is one of the hardest working people I've ever met, if not the hardest. He does not stop. I also think, and this is so obvious to those of us who understand it, but money does not drive him. And I think we have far too many people in power where money and economics is the bottom line. And he was about righteousness, civil rights, and what's good and just. And as a leader, it's what he's continued to believe in. And I think we have a president now whose number one mantra is the dollar. And I think that you look at the distinct and absolute difference in motivation. And I feel like that is why, to this day, people want to spend time with a congressman, and he's called the conscience of the Congress. And it is because true kind of his heart and his narrative has been one of justice and not blinded by any economics at all. And we forget that. I think it's really important. I think it's a very important point.
There's a great scene in your film where you're interviewing Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And she talks about how she was inspired by John Lewis. And she said, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for John Lewis. But she also said that I've learned a lot from John Lewis about how to keep organizing from inside Congress. And I think we have a growing number of people who are running and getting elected to mayor and city council and state legislature and even Congress. There's at least 24 people in Congress who previous jobs were as organizers. And Heather and Jess, what do you make of that? That back in the 60s, a lot of people were organizers, would say the last thing I want to do is run for office, as if you're about to be co-opted. And now we see lots of people who have backgrounds as organizers. In fact, I remember a couple years ago when she was an organizer here in LA, Karen Bass, who's now the chair of the Black Congressional Caucus, came to speak to my organizing class. And one of my students was so impressed with her, and they said, why don't you run for office? And she said, that's the last thing I want to do. A couple years later, she was the head of the Speaker of the State Assembly, and now she is not only the head of the Black Caucus in Congress, but she's being talked about as vice president. So that must be a big change for you to have seen, Heather. And how do you think about that? And Jess, what does your generation of organizers think about people going into public service as elected officials, and how they maintain their sense of moral responsibility in doing that. Heather, do you want to start?
Well, when I mentioned before that we need people on the outside and on the inside, and people who work in partnership. There's a famous story about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but that the head of the clothing workers union had come up to him and said, "We want these changes. We want union rights. We want decent wages. We want decent hours and working conditions." He said, "Okay, you've convinced me. Now go out and make me do it." So the question is to have people inside who understand there's a role for organizing on the outside, and people on the outside to understand we need people on the inside who will be more responsive, even if they're not doing the exact same work and may not have the exact same position. That what we need is the power to win those votes electorally, and the power to move that legislation, which is done by organizing, both in the places in which we're strong, and I would say the blue areas, but also the places where we're not strong, to make sure that people are engaged and feel that, and to engage people, we need the hope that you really can make change. One of the things that I also think builds that hope is seeing people on the inside of the legislative process who either have experience from the streets and organizing, or show an understanding to it, to that organizing, as opposed to the kind of division, dividing us, spreading hate, and trying to dampen people's belief that change is possible.
Thank you. Jess?
Yeah, I think for me, when I hear the kind of transition from people not wanting to run for office to more folks to now, I'm like, for me, it seems like it naturally makes sense in a lot of ways. I think historically it makes sense when we think about the fact that it wasn't until 1971 that 18-year-olds could even run to vote. Could vote. So why could I see myself as a young person running for an election when I just learned to actually be able to vote? When the way that the legislature and our systems of government have been set up is they're set up to favor white property owning cisgendered heterosexual men. Like that is the framework, and so very much then it creates the image that an elected official is not me. It is not anybody that looks like me. And so, I think to add to that, I think that there was, a luxury that, that people outside of political work, leaned into, of kind of seeing movement work very separate from, political work, from civic engagement, from running from office, right? Because it's actually, if we are coordinating amongst those things, if the people that are running for office and the people that are running for campaigns are coordinating with people that are running in the streets, we would have had, we get to the change that we actually need, let's be honest. If it all happens in that way, that's how we get to it. And I think, hearing now and seeing now, even thinking about, the recent elections in New York and Virginia, and thinking about the people that won elections that, people said they had no chance at winning. It's kind of saying that we are at that moment where people understand that we have to occupy all the spaces, and to go and to run for office is a role that we have to fill, and it is a part of movement work. It is not separate. And it is a different relationship of movement work, because you are a decision maker who is writing policy, but you have the chance to write something visionary as much as you have a chance to write something that is, prohibitive and harmful. And so I think that seeing our politicians, our elected officials, at least when they're not targets, as a part of our movement, I think is an important part of the work.
So there's been a bunch of questions from the audience about getting from here to November, and then what do we do after Joe Biden is elected president and the Democrats take back the House and the Senate.
From your lips to God's ears.
Yes. So let's start with from here to November. Heather, both you and Jess have been involved in a lot of voter registration and voter work. And Laura, your work touches a lot on the idea of voter suppression. And we'll talk about that at the end, which we'll get to in about, I think we'll do another 15 minutes or so. So the idea of voter suppression and Trump trying to basically rig the election is a big deal. A lot of people are talking about the youth vote, how important it is to get out the youth vote, the African-American vote, the Latino vote, and young people's vote in general. How is that going to happen in the face of this Republican onslaught all over the country to keep the voter turnout low, particularly among likely Democratic voters? So Jess, since you've done a lot of that work, do you want to start?
Myself, yes, I definitely can. I think that, yes, I think that we absolutely have a lot of work to do, and we have to really hunker down, pay attention on this election with just over 100 days. I think, one thing to look to, right, is that, to be clear, right now, in modern day, in the past, 8 to 10 years, it's actually been harder for Black people to vote than it was when there were actually poll taxes, right? And so there have been consistent attacks that have been happening behind the scenes, literally legislating people's votes away, right? Preventing people who have been incarcerated from being able to vote. In states like Texas, you used to be able to vote with an expired gun license, but you couldn't vote with a student ID. Creating additional hoops for people to be able to even get the ID that they need, right? Making people print out paperwork to be able to vote. I mean, let's look at, to Georgia right now when they had their primary this year. I looked at, in the videos of Black Voters Matter and other folks that were out there literally standing in line to almost midnight to be able to vote in a primary election, right? Also, why we see states that are trying to pass legislation denying, saying that voting by absentee mail isn't actually an appropriate way to vote, right? While also knowing that right now in 15 states in this country, if you want to request an absentee ballot, you have to do it by fax. I have not used a fax in over 18 years. I would not know how to do one. And I'm sorry. And I just I don't even know where to find one. Let alone a landline, right? So I think, I say all that context to say, I believe that, people would not be trying to take away people's right to vote if they didn't see how powerful it really was. If it wasn't powerful, then why would all this legislation be happening? Why would millions of people be consistently denied accessing the right to vote? And so, I think naming that it is a powerful piece, naming that there is a power in it, I think is really important in this moment. And then naming what the potential of that power is post-election for people, naming that, the district attorney is the person that decides very often in these local cases of police violence, whether or not to press charges, knowing that the city council and the mayor are the people that are going to decide how much money goes to building homelessness centers or how much money goes to after-school programs, right? And so I think that, that is going to be what actually gets people to turn out, that and us actually, to be frank, given COVID-19, doing the work to find the people we know that we are in relationship to, that we are accountable to, and who are accountable to us, and making sure that, we're doing as much as we can to make sure that they're educated, they're informed, and their vote is protected, because it's not going to just be a national campaign that gets people out to vote. It's not going to just be being able to, show up and vote in 5 minutes. This is going to be a fight. And I want people to know that it is a fight, but hopefully a righteous one.
Can you say a little more, Jess, about what organizations are out there that people can support if they want to do work and want to help groups that are on the ground trying to encourage more voting?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, if we're, I'll talk about on the infrastructure side right now, I would say, for folks thinking about this absentee issue, since I just named, and I'm probably people named a good fear, that there is a place you can go. Vote America is a new tool that's actually helping people do the technology aspect of, getting their absentee votes. I think also, thinking about organizations, of course, the tried and true, like NAACP, I will be amiss if I didn't say that. But also, you know, my political home, Black Youth Project 100, has been doing movement work and is also doing election work, and as are many organizations that are part of the movement for Black Lives and a part of that electoral justice program. And so, you know, they've released their plan for what they're doing around the election. I would highly encourage folks to check out the Movement for Black Lives website and see the work that they're talking about. The narrative also about how they're talking about this election right now is really important. And then I think, you know, really looking to, you know, the state youth organizations and the younger voices, I think is so beautiful right now. So I think about Future Coalition, you know, representing the youngest of the young, but building the broadest fight. You know, I think about, you know, state organizations, you know, like Georgia Shift in Georgia and New Georgia Project, who are just literally holding every level of the work and somehow still making it seem like it is the easy work to do. That, you know, there in any state you can list, I could probably go on for forever, right? But I'll also say, if that is something folks are interested in, if you're like, where is this organization that is doing this locally? I probably can guarantee that I know at least one organization in every 50 states, and I'm sure Heather knows at least 5 more for every one I know.
Okay, great. Thank you. Heather?
Mostly I say amen to everything that that Jess said. For what we do between now and the end of the election, 3 levels occur to me. One is that we need to convey a positive message that voting will matter and that everyone's going to go vote. The more we say people aren't voting, it depresses the vote. And that's what Trump wants. He wants us divided. The more we show we're divided, the more it depresses the vote. And so a positive message, it will make a difference, and everyone's doing it, and you join in and do it too. The second is we need to do the work. Again, I say amen to everything Jessica said. There are programs now for texting, and those of us who are older, we can learn how to text. They'll train us. For phone calling, for letter writing. In some places, there are people who are going outside. And there are organizations, all those Jessica mentioned. They have roles. They'll teach us. They'll pair us up. They'll find ways we can do something with whatever little time we have. You have an hour, they'll find something to do. You have 10 hours a week. You are full-time. Consider even working full-time, at least that last period of time. There's so many groups. I'd also mention Michelle Obama has an organization. There's a coalition of an alliance of many organizations with grassroots members called Movement Voter Project. There's Swing Left. There's the Democratic Party itself. Whatever fits your needs and interest, there'll be organizations for you. So the second is to do the work. The third is to spread the message. The second is to do the work. The third, and a caution, is it doesn't end on election day. Many in the audience probably know this because it's probably a very savvy group out there. But the expectation is that if Trump loses this election, first of all, it may not be clear on election day because many may be voting by mail, and it may look on election night that whoever wins may not be the person who wins once all the votes are counted. But he will agitate a base who comes out with AK-47s, even at the polling places, to frighten people. And then it will go on until the votes are all counted, and then it may go on even further. It may go into the courts. It may even get thrown into the House of Representatives with specific rules. This may go on for quite some time. And so the time between the election and January 20th, inauguration, is also a pivotal time. And so people can't give up. If you've got your holiday plans, at least consider also playing a role for voter protection and for constant mobilization so they don't steal it from us yet again.
Great, that's good warning and good.
Organize.
Good advice. So I want to come to after the election's over. We'll do that last, but I want to ask Laura a question that several people asked in one form or another. What did Congressman Lewis expect to get out of cooperating with you from this movie? I don't mean money or fame. He already had the fame. He doesn't need the money. So what was the political or strategic or moral reason why he agreed to do this? And how do you think it, and tell us a little more about the trajectory of the film, when we'll all be able to see it, when other people will be able to see it in theaters and on TV and so forth.
It's a great question, Peter. He never said to us specifically what he hopes to get out of it. I think he was 78 when we started. I think he felt, and he'd been asked, by the way, for years, many filmmakers and many producing teams had asked him, and his staff say that, he'd politely agreed to appear in many documentaries, including, the one that Don and I did on Bobby Kennedy. But I think he was ready for his story to be told. I think he really admired Dawn's work. Many people, I think, told him about Dawn and her filmography and the work we had just done. Also, we have CNN behind us, as well as Participant, Magnolia, Ford Foundation, AGC. We have an amazing group. We have some, individuals who supported us very generously. I think having CNN come first, he has a great respect for media. I wanted to say one other thing I think we have to do leading up to the election is support good journalism. I'll always say that because I work in media. I think it's very important. And I think for him, he had seen RBG. I think he'd seen a number of documentaries on PBS, on CNN, etc., on Netflix, and he thought, you know what, it is time to tell my story. And we were really thrilled because, to have him actively participate for a year, and we had to juggle his schedule. It was incredibly busy. Like he would be, filming with Dawn, and then he'd be like, "Oh, I've got to run to vote." We'd be in a small office on the Hill. And he'd be like, "I got to go vote." And he'd come back 2 hours later. I mean, this man never stopped working. And for us, it was really important to show that he was, and is a working congressman. And that, that list that Don includes of all of his accomplishments in terms of bills that he's proposed, had passed, or is still working on is really important. It's a very long list. Head of Ways and Means Committee, many committees that he's chaired. So I think for him, he just wanted to share his story. But frankly, he is one of the most humble human beings. He would never say, "This is my expectation." As I said earlier, he really put his story and trust into Dawn. And you see that in the film. They've become very close and fast friends.
And when will it be seen on CNN?
I'm glad you're asking. It will be, as we're doing virtual screenings all through summer. So we're really grateful for all the support until September. And it's looking, I don't know the exact date, but end of September is when CNN is saying it'll be available. We'll have a big network premiere. They do want to get it on before the election.
And for those of you in the audience that, like me, are college professors or high school teachers, I'd recommend 2 documentaries to show students that things can change. One is the documentary about Heather, called Heather Booth Changing the World, and the other is this film, John Lewis, Good Trouble. And so I hope those of us in the teaching profession will use these films to inspire our students. So the last question I want to ask everybody is, and this comes from a number of the people in the audience in one form or another, Biden wins the election. The Democrats keep the House and take back the Senate. That's not going to be easy, but it's very doable. It's doable. Then what? As Heather said, we have to keep going between November and January. Obviously, we have to keep organizing to push Biden in the right direction. What is that going to look like? What do you think the first 100 days of the Biden administration will look like? What should activists be doing for those first 100 days and over the next 4 years? I know that's a long question and we only have a few minutes, but if you could each give a minute or so or 2 minutes to thinking about what do we do when Biden and the Democrats win? And let's start with Jess.
Oh, my answer might not be as as pretty as maybe it should be, but I think that, what do we do in the first 100 days is that we still have to push in a lot of the same ways, to be clear. We're going to have to hold the people who got elected accountable to the things that people are fighting for. And that's going to be very much not a thing that's just happening, you know, in the Beltway of DC. It's going to have to be something that, you know, folks are championing, you know, locally in their cities and in their state capitals, to make sure that a lot of what's happening right now, a lot of the policy demands and things that people are crying for, you know, don't just go, you know, back down on the priority list, you know. And so I think that, you know, that's going to be the work, right? Is like, what does it look like for us to do this hard next 120 something days, and then know that really, you know, that's just so that it's just the first incubation phase of a larger campaign that we're going to have to start moving into 2021. I also think, you know, we're going to have to also keep in mind that there are going to be a lot of other elections that are also still happening. I will say that, like, you know, this doesn't end. So that's one thing I like taking elections out of the context, is like, this is just one part of a larger cycle. It is not a cycle in itself. And that's probably how I've been able to stay in elections for so long, even though I know folks are probably thinking I look very young. I am often called a yelder, which is a youth elder in movement and political work. So, you know, it's definitely understanding that, you know, this, you know, turning out to vote on election day is literally just step 3 or 4 in the process of us taking 20 steps towards, you know, the change we're really working for. So it's continuing to show up and continuing to do the work.
Okay, Heather?
Again, I'm so glad to follow Jess in so many ways. Yes, the struggle goes on. There's a song from Sweet Honey in the Rock, which people may know, and the chorus goes, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes." And it's words from Ella Baker, who's in the movie, was the initiator of the idea behind SNCC, the youth organization that was put to music by Sweet Honey. So we cannot rest. The organizing continues. I think for a new administration, there's clearly a legislative agenda in so many areas. It's not just one. It's on criminal justice. It's on people getting the money they deserve for the work that they do. It's a decent wage. It's education, healthcare. So there's a legislative agenda. There's personnel. Personnel is policy. And who is appointed to the offices for the administration, for the regulations, for the enforcing of those laws is also critical, as well as the justices that are appointed. We see how important that is. And then there's also a spirit that needs to be created. Part of what I'm looking forward to is a time when our leadership has a spirit of empathy and saying we're in it together, that it's about all of us, not just about one person, and not spewing hate and division. And for that, we need to organize. Peter, I didn't know if these are also our ending comments. I wanted to share one quote from Dr. King, or it's attributed to Dr. King, that I know John Lewis ascribes to. And that is that he's supposed to have said, "Vision without action is only a dream. Action without vision is a waste of time. But vision with action can change the world." And if there's one thing that I hope to leave people with who are activists, that's why you've tuned in, who are visionaries, it's why you're part of this discussion, but to carry on that combination of vision and action, organizing to change the world.
That's great, Heather. Great. Jess, would you like to have a 1-minute closing comment? And then Laura?
I mean, you know, I don't really have a closing comment per se, but, you know, I will say that, you know, I'm happy to see all of the folks that have committed and coming onto this call and have stayed on this entire time. I've also been trying to answer some of the questions that I saw folks put out, you know, because I hear people saying, you know, what can we do? What does it look like? Where do I go? How can I be more helpful? And just want to say that, you know, you know, this is just, you know, one touch point. And as someone who is a kinesthetic learner and a trainer who has been siloed thanks to COVID-19, I will say is, as much as it is helpful to talk or to, give, questions over email and continue the conversation in different ways, would love to be supportive of that. I think, especially in this moment right now, just even thinking about this, and, we haven't talked about this here, but a lot of times the work is siloed even, in identities and communities, and then also to seem as if, the young people are doing this and older generations are doing this. And very much what I've seen of this moment, and especially of what's winning right now, is intergenerational work and people understanding that, our livelihoods and our ability to live and to survive and to thrive is intrinsically connected to each one of us. And I think that, that would be the last thing I would say. And I understand my role in this, and I hope that you all are committing your role to this moving forward too.
Thank you. That's great, Jess. And Laura, last word, a minute.
Well, I just want to say thank you. And thank you for watching our documentary. I'd like to say also, it's very much what Heather and Jess so eloquently stated. I think it's coming together. It's having hard conversations, and it's joining hands, and really, really over the next 100+ days, dedicating more than 50% of our time. I mean, I really do believe, people ask me, what do you do for a living? I say, I make programming, I make important programming and documentaries, and I'm trying to activate. And I think if we all keep that in our head space for the next 100 and some days to get to where we need to. I just want to add one thing is, everyone, thank you for watching our film. The other thing, when Congressman Lewis, Don and I were talking at one point about what needs to happen when we get this current regime out, he says, some of them have to be arrested. We cannot stop until they go to jail. And I think that is something we all need to think about. We have a court system that's being packed. We have illegal appointments. There's a lot of work that's going to be done to right all the wrongs that have happened over these 4 years.
Thank you, Laura.
By the way, one last thing, Peter, I don't think I said it, but today is your birthday, and we all should say happy birthday to you.
This was the best birthday. This is the best birthday present I could have had. So thank you. This is wonderful. It was just an accident that we scheduled this for today, but I'm glad we did. So I think I might have learned this from Heather, but at some point somebody told me, you never end a meeting without giving people something to do. Otherwise, they're just an audience as opposed to an active constituency. So all of you who have been on this call, we have your email addresses. We're not going to use them for any ill purposes, but we will send you this wonderful handbook that the filmmakers put together called the Good Trouble Handbook, about what you can do to promote voting rights and to get involved in your local community where lots of good things are happening. We will also send you, and if you act now, we will also send you, we will send you a list of organizations like Swing Vote and others like that you can get connected to around other issues and around voting. And so we hope that this webinar, this panel, and the film that Laura and Dawn made inspired you to do what you were probably doing anyway, but to do it even more, as Heather and Jess said, to bring about the change we need and to bring about the kind of society that we want. And so to echo what Congressman Lewis says at the end of the film, we hope you have a good day. We hope you have a good year. We hope you get everyone out to vote and be happy.
You know what happened.